Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this event, this great event in Valparaíso. I'm sorry I can't see you, and you can see me, but that may be your disadvantage. So, I'm going to speak of Mary Shelley's novel on Frankenstein. No written work of the Romantic school of literature has been of greater interest to 20th century scholarship. Almost as much literary fascination has been aroused by its genesis as by the novel. This was at a house party in the holiday home of Lord Byron on Lake Geneva in June 1816. Present at the Villa Diodati with Lord Byron were the poet Percy Shelley and Mary Godwin as she was then, plus her stepsister Claire Claremont and Dr. Polidori, a young doctor. Mary Shelley's own account of this episode is in the preface she wrote 15 years later for the 1831 third edition of her novel, Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the name of a hilltop castle near the Rhine, which was visited by the Shelley party en route to Lake Geneva. John Conrad Dippel, a pastor's son, was born there in 1673. He became a fashionable physician who bought it later. He was also an alchemist and a dabbler in human dissection, and he adopted the name Dippel Frankenstein. Through her journal and letters, and the diary of Dr. Polidori, we now know a good deal more about that time in Geneva than Mary disclosed in the preface. Much has been written on Frankenstein from various points of view, and it is not my intention to summarize or supersede these, but as an analyst, a psychoanalyst, to explore Mary Shelley's relationship to it. In order to do this, I treat the preface of 1831 as if it was like a preliminary consultation, with the other parts of her history and the novel itself as what might have emerged in a subsequent analysis. So, starting at this imaginary consultation, we know that her husband, the poet Shelley, drowned in a boating accident in Italy 9 years before, in 1822, and that she has one surviving child, now Percy, aged 12. 4 years before this consultation, in 1826, she published another science fiction novel, The Last Man, in which a pandemic wiped out all humanity, leaving one man anticipating his own death, sitting in the ruins of Rome. And she began writing this novel, The Last Man, in 1924, the month that Byron died in Greece. By then, of that Geneva summer party, only she and Claire were still alive. Shelley was dead, Byron was dead, and Dr. Polidori had poisoned himself with prussic acid, aged only 21. So, let us imagine that Mary Shelley is consulting us in 1831, when at 34 years old, she's about to publish the third edition of Frankenstein. She comes with a question on her mind. How did she, an 18-year-old girl, come to think of and dilate upon so very hideous an idea? As I would with a consultation, I will underline what seems significant in the preface and also what facts are missing, such as those that would have emerged in a subsequent analysis. She begins by saying that as the daughter of two persons of distinguished literary celebrity, she thought she should be a writer. Her father, William Godwin, was the famous radical author of Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, and her mother, Mary Wollstonecroft, of the equally famous Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Her husband, Percy Shelley, Mary said, was very anxious that she should prove herself worthy of her parentage and enroll herself on the page of fame. Though as a child she wrote stories, these were realistic and nothing as compared with her secret daydreams. Her secret daydreams were at once more fantastic and agreeable. She said they were her refuge when annoyed and her deepest pleasure when free. And she emphasizes that she was not confined to her own identity in these daydreams. She became others, and so peopled them with creatures far more interesting than her own sensations. So, in the summer of 1816, this group in the Villa Diodati read German ghost stories to frighten each other. And she remembers two of them as if they were told yesterday. One is of a lover who clasps his bride to whom he had pledged his vows, only to find himself in the arms of the ghost of the woman he'd deserted. And the other is of the sinful founder of his race who is fated to bestow death on his beloved sons when he kisses them. They, from the hour of the kiss, withered like flowers snapped upon the stalk. At Lord Byron's suggestion, they agreed to invent a frightening story each. She adds that she listened to a discussion between Byron and Shelley on the basis of life and the hints of reanimation that Galmanism had given by producing movement in corpses. Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with vital warmth, she says. This, interestingly, also describes her method as a writer. She makes a very strong statement about the creation of fiction. Everything must have a beginning. Invention does not consist in creating out of void, but out of chaos. The materials must, in the first place, be afforded. It, invention, can give form to dark, shapeless substances, but it cannot bring into being the substance itself. In our terms, she is saying the unconscious has to provide the raw material for invention to shape a story. This is very similar to Freud's idea of secondary revision, making a narrative from dream elements, which he compared as analogous to a daydream. If we see this secondary revision, like daydream, as a sort of closure, hopefully putting the lid back on unconscious fantasy, sometimes I think we could see it working in reverse. And I suggest that Mary's daydream of scientific experiment opened a door to unconscious fantasies of a dreadful scene of childbirth. When she went to bed that night in the Villa Diodati, this is what she describes. I saw with shut eyes, but acute mental vision, the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he has put together. She saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine shows signs of life. She emphasizes that she was possessed by her unbidden and uncontrollable imagination, far beyond reverie. This clearly was no daydream. I would call it a night terror, a sleep-induced visual hallucination that persisted on waking. Then she saw the artist rush away from his odious handiwork, and she describes how he hoped that sleep might abolish his horror, and the silence of the grave abolish the hideous animated corpse. But when he opens his eyes, behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains and looking at him with yellow, watery, but expectant eyes. She opened her eyes with terror at this point, but could not rid herself of the visual phantom. She tried unsuccessfully to distract herself by trying to think of a ghost story, until, swift as light and as cheering, she had the idea that what terrified her will terrify others, that she needed only to describe the spectre that had haunted her midnight pillow to be free of it. So she began the next day telling her story. This process that leaves her feeling cheery we would call projective identification, and Mary Shelley was a past master of it. In her daydreaming, her storytelling, and in the construction of her novels. What she leaves out of this imputed consultation is of more significance than what is included. First, more on her distinguished parentage. She was the only child of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecroft, but she never knew her mother, as the mother died from puerperal sepsis 11 days after giving birth. She knew her only from her writings and her childhood daydreams, as she often sat by her mother's grave. And it was on her mother's grave that Shelley seduced her when she was 16. Mary had an older half-sister, Fanny, whose father was Gilbert Imlay, an American who Mary Wollstonecroft lived with in Paris during the French Revolution and the subsequent terror. He abandoned her when back in London, leaving her desperately suicidal. William Godwin helped her to recover, and despite their mutual scorn of convention, they married, and Mary was the product of their union. After his wife's death, Godwin was determined to produce a proper family, and he believed he'd achieved this by remarrying when Mary was 4. However, Mary detested her stepmother, who brought with her 2 step-siblings, Charles and Claire. Godwin thought he had created a happy family. What Mary thought he created was a hell on earth. The presence of Claire Claremont, her stepsister, is one of the most notable omissions from her recollected account of the Diodati party. There were, in fact, 5 of them, and it was Claire who had engineered their presence by seducing Byron a short time before in London. Also with them in Geneva was William, Mary's 6-month-old baby, and his name is of considerable significance. It was her father's name, and until she was born, it was the name they proposed for her, constantly spoken of by the expectant parents as they planned William's, their son's, education. Mary then gave this name to her son, her second child, and it is the name she gives in her novel to Victor Frankenstein's little brother, who is the monster's first victim. Mary's first child was a girl who, born prematurely, died nameless a few days after birth. In her journal of March 1815, she wrote, I dreamed that my little baby came to life again. I awake and find no baby. I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might in process of time renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. Her son William was born a year later. When Shelley and Mary had eloped originally in 1814, 2 years before the holiday at the villa, they took with them Claire Clairmont. They became a ménage à trois of sorts. They were supposedly all advocates of free love. Otaheite philosophers, Claire named them, referring to the stories of promiscuity of the newly discovered islanders of Tahiti. When they signed the hotel register at Chamonix, they provocatively described themselves as atheists in the hotel register. But by 1816, Mary's idea of bliss was to be without Claire. She wrote to Shelley, "Give me a garden and absentia Clarii, and I will thank my love for many favors." There were other unmentioned uncomfortable facts. When they eloped in 1814, Shelley had abandoned his wife and child when she was 5 months into a second pregnancy. So, we have as unmentioned background facts to her nightmare, her mother's death in childbirth, Shelley's abandonment of Harriet and his children, her experience of having a dead baby girl, the birth of a son to whom she gave her own prenatal name, and her increasing hostility to Claire. Overdetermination seems to be an understatement. But I think the immediate provocation of the night terror is another omission. It is the drama that occurred during Byron's reading of Coleridge's poem Christabel. And we know this from Dr. Polidori's diary. Lord Byron repeated some verses of Coleridge's Christabel, of the witch's breast, when silence ensued, and Shelley, shrieking and putting his hands to his head, ran out of the room with a candle. I threw water in his face and after gave him some ether. He was looking at Mrs. S. and suddenly thought of a woman he had heard of who had eyes instead of nipples, which taking off his mind horrified him. The Christabel is a strange, supernatural, quasi-medieval epic written by Coleridge as a successor to the Ancient Mariner. Christabel, personification of virginal beauty, leaves her father's castle at midnight and goes to the wood where she rescues Geraldine, whom she takes to be a maiden in distress, but who subsequently bewitches and seduces her. And this is the passage that provoked Shelley's hallucination of the eyes instead of nipples. Beneath the lamp, the lady bowed and slowly rolled her eyes around. Then drawing in her breath aloud, like one that shuddered, she unbound the cincture from beneath her breast. Her silken robe and inner vest dropped to her feet, and in full view, behold her bosom and half her side, a sight to dream of, not to tell. Oh, shield her, shield sweet Christabel. This poem and Shelley's hysterical reaction were amongst the assembly of disturbing experiences, unconscious fantasies, guilty secrets, wishful daydreams that joined together to become a horrifying night dream of which the dreamer Mary no longer had control. Like the student of unhallowed arts, she just wished it would go away. And he hoped that he might sleep and that the silence of the grave would quench forever the transient existence of the hideous corpse which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. Her night terror begins its daytime transformation when the dreamer becomes the author, with a story that will terrify others. The creature's development continues as she makes it into a novel. And Christabel, the poem, played a further part when 2 months later Shelley read it aloud, this time without incident. The poem has 2 elements of particular relevance to Mary's novel. One is motherlessness, and the other is gaze. In the poem, Christabel says of her mother, "She died the hour that I was born." And gaze is also central in both Christabel and the novel. Coleridge, taking his cue from Milton, describes a transformation in Geraldine's eyes. The lady's eyes, they shrunk in her head, each shrunk up to a serpent's eye, and with somewhat of malice and more of dread. At Christabel she looked askance. This word, askance, is the word used in Paradise Lost, when Satan looks on at Adam and Eve making love. And what do we think is passing through Mary's mind, listening to Shelley read this together with Claire, as she hears Sir Leoline, Christabel's father, proposing to adopt Geraldine, and when Christabel pleads to her father, "By my soul I do entreat that thou this woman send away." So from night terror to novel. Mary dealt with her night terror by turning it into a short story, and then over 9 months into a novel. In this novel, Victor Frankenstein, ambitious young scientist, creates a living man from bits and pieces, but when his creation actually comes to life, he is horrified by its appearance and flees. He hopes to escape into sleep, but he walks into a nightmare. There he meets and embraces his fiancée Elizabeth, but at the first kiss, she is transformed into the rotting corpse of his dead mother, with grave worms crawling in her shroud. When horrified, he wakes. He sees the creature at his bedside, looking at him expectantly with outstretched hand. In horror, Frankenstein rushes off again. From then, like Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, he doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on, and no more turns his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. From July of the next year, Mary worked on the novel, whilst concurrently reading Paradise Lost, and she finished it in May 1817. But a great deal happened in those 9 months. They had returned to England to relative poverty and to 2 suicides. Mary's half-sister Fanny, who felt excluded from the Shelley entourage, killed herself, and Harriet Smith, Shelley's abandoned wife, drowned herself. Shelley and Mary married in December of that year, despite which Shelley failed in court to get custody of his 2 children. But on the positive side, the Shelleys' marriage, though scorned as a bourgeois concession by Shelley and Claire, reconciled Mary with her delighted father, from whom she had painfully been estranged since her elopement. And the Leigh Hunts, the couple who were Keats' main supporters, befriended them, and in their cheerful, child-filled home in Hampstead, dominated by Mrs. Leigh Hunt, Mary experienced real happiness at last, and she conceived again in December. So I turn now to the novel. The novel has a complex form. There are 3 narrators. Victor Frankenstein, the scientist, his creation, the monster, and Robert Walton, who relays all their stories to his sister by letter. Walton does this whilst trying to find an unprecedented North Passage through the Arctic ice. The unusual structure and ambience of this novel only resembles one other English novel of the century, Wuthering Heights, which was written 30 years later by another great daydreamer, Emily Bronte. Muriel Sparks' apt biographical comment on Emily Bronte that until she wrote Wuthering Heights, Emily Bronte did not know herself. I think this applies even more to Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. We know from Mary's account of her daydreaming method that she inhabits 3 characters of her novel. She speaks for them, and they speak for her. I think Robert Walton, the intrepid Arctic adventurer, is an old daydream character from her childhood years in Scotland. Victor Frankenstein, the second narrator, the new Prometheus, is modeled on Shelley, Byron, and William Lawrence, who was the controversial professor of evolutionary anatomy. The third, and by far the most eloquent voice, is that of the monster, and he speaks for Mary's unconscious, saying things she does not really know about herself. And he does so in 2 major passages. In the first, accusingly, he addresses Victor Frankenstein, who created him and rejected him. In the second major passage, over the dead body of Frankenstein, he explains his own destructiveness, his suffering, and his guilt. His first speech, the creature's speech, some years after his disastrous birth or creation, follows his first 2 crimes: the murder of the boy William, Victor's little brother, and his culpable incrimination of the boy's nursemaid Justine, who was then wrongly judged and executed. The central provocation of both these crimes is a locket worn by William with a picture of his dead, beautiful mother. The creature said, "No mother had blessed me with smiles and caresses." And remember, he said to Frankenstein, "I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel. I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous. Will no entreaties cause you to turn a favorable eye upon thy creature? You, my creator, abhor me. What hope can I gather from your fellow creatures? They spurn and hate me." He argues that the hateful, horrified eye turned on him as the newborn creature makes him a fiend. The monster explains that after leaving his birthplace in Frankenstein's rooms, he eventually had found a family living in a cottage on which he could and did spy unseen. There, with a mixture of observation and idealization, he had learnt language, history, and human relationships. And he then found some books, Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, and The Sorrows of Werther, the key precursors of the Romantic writers. And this formed the basis of his self-education, secretly and unseen. But it was the horrified rejection of him by this ideal family when he finally plucked up courage to approach them and let them see him that inflamed his anger. From that moment, he said, "I declared everlasting war against the species. If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear." The monster's proposed solution is for Frankenstein to create a bride for him, who would reciprocate his love and thus render him benign. If any being felt emotions of benevolence towards me, I should return them 100-fold. I would make peace with the whole kind. My Creator, make me happy. Let me feel gratitude towards you for one benefit. Victor Frankenstein is reluctantly persuaded by this promise and prepares himself to do this in remote Scotland, to prepare a bride for Frankenstein. At the last moment, when he's about to give life to this newly created female, whilst watched through the window by the creature, he changes his mind and furiously destroys his work. The monster, enraged, cries out, "Shall each man find a wife for his bosom, and each beast have his mate, and I be alone? Remember," he says, "I shall be with you on your wedding night." There are then two more murders. Clerval, Victor's ideal bosom friend, and Elizabeth, his bride, on their wedding night and before their marriage was consummated. This radically changes the story. Up to this point, Frankenstein was haunted by the creature. Now, as his pursuer, he became the hunter and the monster the hunted. We do not meet the monster again until Robert Walton finds him crouched over the dead body of Frankenstein, who died on board Walton's ship. Victor's last effort had been to inspire Robert and his crew by his rhetoric to persist in their hazardous mission to their near-certain death in the Arctic. Despite this rhetoric, Robert Walton turned for home and survival rather than heroic, fatal failure. And the monster speaking over Victor's, Frankenstein's dead body, who had died of exhaustion in vain pursuit, says of him, "In his murder, my crimes are consummated. O Frankenstein, generous and self-devoted being, what does it avail that I now ask thee to pardon me?" The monster describes how he was driven to a terrible revenge when Frankenstein, who destroyed his hopes of marital fulfillment, planned to marry himself. When I discovered the author of my existence dared hope for happiness, then impotent envy and bitter indignation filled me with an insatiable thirst for vengeance. "Evil thenceforth became my good," he says, quoting Satan from Paradise Lost. But he claims that though he inflicted pain on Frankenstein, he suffered not the 10,000th part of the anguish that was mine during its execution. A frightful selfishness hurried me on, while my heart was poisoned with remorse. My heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, and when wrenched by misery to vice and hatred, it did not endure the violence of the change without torture. I was the slave, not the master of an impulse, which I detested, yet could not disobey. And yet there's a flourish of final masochistic triumph, as the monster leaves the ship planning to die by fire. "Farewell, Frankenstein, blasted as thou wert, my agony was still superior to thine, for the bitter sting of remorse may not cease to rankle in my wounds until death shall close them forever." So what to make of this novel? A remarkable novel. It gives a sense of the literary context in which Mary wrote this, to bear in mind that it's written about the same time that Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice. And it has been said that this Frankenstein turned the genre of fashionable superstitious Gothic novels into science fiction. It was also the first novel to be written by a woman contemporaneously with her experience of childbirth. Mary actually was very fond of children, but imaginatively she describes the absolute horror of perinatal rejection, primary rejection, for both mother and child. It's the antithesis of Wordsworth's infant babe, who, nursed in his mother's arms, doth gather passion from his mother's eyes. The antithesis is the creature who looks expectantly only to see horror and hatred in them. This, Mary unhesitatingly suggests, means that he will only repeat this experience. There is then an interlude in the account of her creature's mental development, in which she follows Locke's ideas, the philosopher Locke's ideas, and her own father's Benthamite views. These psychologically optimistic ideas, however, are rudely interrupted by the next major experience of rejection by the creature, and that leads to his war on the species. As we listen to her monster speaking of his experience, we hear instead the philosophical voice of David Hume rather than John Locke. Reason, said Hume, is the slave of the passions. Natural beliefs inform daily life, not golden reason, says Hume. I was the slave, not the master of an impulse which I detested yet could not disobey, says the monster. In his first speech, we could say he was in what I would call the paranoid schizoid position, but in the second, in the depressive position. In the novel, his account reminds me of Melanie Klein's first description of the depressive position in a psychotic version, when she said, "But it is the ego's hatred of the id which is paramount in this phase. It is the ego's unconscious knowledge that the hate may get the upper hand, which brings about the sorrow, feelings of guilt, and the despair which underlie grief." In Mary Shelley's novel, only Robert Walton, of her three narrators, survives. Victor Frankenstein dies after urging everyone on the ship to continue a suicidal mission. The monster leaves the ship to embrace a self-inflicted, painful death. Only Robert Walton, the intrepid explorer, remains, judiciously but reluctantly turning for home. The monster of the deep unconscious is returned to ashes. Frankenstein, the ego ideal, is safely housed in idealized posterity, and only Robert, the ego, steers back into more mundane and safer waters. Mary Shelley's is not a Gothic novel. Unlike them, it is not a supernatural horror story. The creator's horror is the beginning of a natural tragedy. It's one when a mother who looks at a newborn baby sees a monster. This monster is not superhuman, he is all too human. Her daydreaming has not provided an escape from her unconscious, it has opened the door to it. However, she finds a new home for horror in the minds of her readers. And now she says, in her preface on launching a new edition, "Once again I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper. I have an affection for it was the offspring of happy days, when death and grief were but words which found no echo in my heart." Though worse followed for her, including the death of 2 more children and of her husband, can we really accept her claim of happy days when death and grief were just words? Is not this retrospective denial as her extraordinarily wise monster says, "Of what a strange nature is knowledge. It clings to the mind, whence once it has seized on it like lichen on a rock. I wish sometimes to shake off all thought and feeling, but I learned that there was but one means to overcome the sensation of pain, and that was death." Thank you.